morning staring at this book. So I picked it up. It's a book I have read again and again. But I wondered what attracted it to my attention. I'm talking about this book, A Short History of Conquest and Rule. What Britain Did to Nigeria by Max Siolun. So I started reading it again. At that point, I decided to change the topic I was to treat on this edition of State Affairs. Because while reading Max Siolun's book, I saw the consequences of past actions, past belief, the kind of ideology that sustained the major ethnic blocs, and how Britain intervened to aggravate the matter. I said, okay, we've been discussing the January 15th, 1966 coup. And so far, we've looked at the ideology behind the coup. We've mentioned the names involved in the coup. And we've been able to trace some of the causes of the coup. Example, Operation Wetier in the Western region. We also looked at the state of emergency declared in the Western region. So in the First Republic, you can rightly say that the Western region was the epicenter of political crisis in Nigeria. Having studied that, and having seen the point Max Siolun makes in his book, I feel we should reflect on a contemporary issue that is disturbing. And this contemporary issue is also linked to the political crisis of the First Republic. Remember why we were reading this book by Obafemi Awolowo, The Travails of Democracy? Something was revealed. Awolowo's idea of fighting feudalism in the North. And remember, on Thursday last week, we defined feudalism, what it means. What are the consequences of the feudalistic behavior of the North from the jihad to the First Republic? One of the consequences of feudalism is the present bandit or herdsman crisis, as the case may be. So when you talk about banditry today, you are talking about the consequences of the politics of the First Republic. You would recall that Buhari kept talking about grazing routes, that it is possible we opened the grazing routes so that Fulani herdsmen could move freely from the north to the south. But if you checked the grazing routes are no longer the grazing routes of the past. Some parts of the routes have been blocked. They have buildings on them. But Buhari kept re-echoing them. The grazing route started even before Nigeria's independence. So that's why I'm saying that this book, What Britain Did to Nigeria, refocused my attention. And that refocused attention defines the subject we are treating on this edition of State Affairs. We have not deviated from the coup, no. But we have just stepped forward ahead of time to say, this happened in the 60s, this happened in the 50s, and here are the consequences of those crises. So we are moving forward to remind you that history will repeat itself if we don't learn from it. Let me take you through some words. And it has to do with the ideas of Francis Fukuyama. One thing we do on State Affairs is to embrace history as the foundation of our content. And history is about understanding the character of the state, the character of the family, the character of things. So the author of the book, The End of History and the Origin of Political Order, Francis Fukuyama, says that things that happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago continue to exert major influence on the nature of politics. So I want you to keep that with you. Things that happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago continue to exert major influence on the nature of politics. So that is the core message of this class. That the banditry you see today, the Boko Haram you see today, are fallout of the politics of the past. The fallout of Buhari's politics of 2015 to 2023, we will also pay the price for it as we go. The fallout of Tinubu's politics of grabbing, we will also pay. It will reflect on the future. That is why men and women of goodwill must continuously study contemporary politics in order to project the future on the line of prosperity. If we miss the study of today, if we take it for granted, we will pay the price in the future. The future is not a vacuum. It is always linked to the past. And that is why Francis Fukuyama, in the book, The End of History and the Origin of Political Order, makes the point that things that happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago continue to exert major influence on the nature of politics. He proceeds that the understanding of institutions is the knowledge of their origins and the forces that created them. The notion is critical mind who wants to learn. This book can be a Bible to the critical mind that wants to learn. If you want to deepen your understanding of development, how a country can be moved from poverty to posterity, you don't have to look too far. The book that can be your guide is this one, From Third Word to First by Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew. From Third Word to First. Singapore and the Asian economic boom. So the book is about how an extraordinary personality took his country from poverty to posterity. Lee Kuan Yew, father of Singapore, is a lesson in prudent leadership. He led the emergence of a nation state by substituting resources with discipline. He came with that superior intelligence to do better than other leaders. What Lee Kuan Yew did was to install first-world infrastructure for Singapore, a country with no natural resources, a man turned it to a global trade center and a beacon of posterity. In his book, he said, "We cannot afford to forget that public order, personal security, economic and social progress, and prosperity are not the natural order of things, that they depend on ceaseless effort and attention from an honest and effective government that the people must elect." In a public discourse, elders Felix Adenaike and General Adebayo expressed admirations of Lee. You could see that day in 2014, I was watching these two old men. Adenaike was a former editor-in-chief of the Tribune newspaper. Adebayo, a former governor of Old Oyo State. And we were discussing Linkwayu in such an exciting manner that I could not help to go back home that day and say, let me reread Linkwayu to understand him better. So let me take you to that discourse and we will continue the reflection.
When are we going to have the likes of Pandit Nehru in 1940? When are we going to have the likes of Pandit Nehru in 1948 and late Linkwayu? When they became leaders of their country, Pandit Nehru attended Oxford. He graduated from Oxford, from Oxford. He came back and burnt all his suits and was wearing made in India garments. In his days, only this Russian car, Moscovich, yes, was available in India. No other brand of cars. Now, it's a free-for-all here. Then when Linkwayu got there, his book, I recommend his book, From Third World to the First, to everybody here. He said we should dress in simple shirts, white shirt on top of brown or black trousers. That was what they were all wearing. It is all members of the cabinet. They don't have any natural resource in. They import sand in Singapore. But look at, they are in the first world now. When are we going to have leaders like that? Because it is leaders who make countries with a people minded like their leaders.
Felix, let me just make one little point, because you mentioned somebody who actually is very dear to my heart, which is Lee Kuan Yew. Now, Lee Kuan Yew had a vision of what his country should be. When he left office after retiring, are you aware where he retired into? Do you know? Yes. So, do you know where he was living? Because I have an account of two people, independent people, who visited Lee Kuan Yew after he left public office. They were shocked to see that in his apartment, it was so bare, and if you visited him, you sat on cane chair. And one of the accounts these people gave me was that Lee Kuan Yew used to tell them that he felt very sorry about Nigeria, and that Nigeria was the hope for Africa, but successively we squandered all the goodwill, all the material things which we had. It's late now, as you know. Now, if it is the will of God, maybe he will give us a Lee Kuan Yew. You see, Because the problems that Lee Kuan Yew faced are not too dissimilar from the point of view of ethnicity. Nevertheless, he made a mark for Singapore.
So the elders have explained the Lee Kuan Yew they know. So you heard the voices of Felix Adenike, former editor-in-chief of the Tribune newspaper. You also heard the voice of General Adebayo, former military governor of Oyo State. Lee Kuan Yew did was to take Singapore, by far the smallest country in Southeast Asia, from third world poverty to first world posterity. He says this book, Phyllis Adenike said there that you should read this book. I also recommend this book to you. Read this book, From Third World to First, by Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew says that this book is an account of the problems his colleagues, and him faced, and how they set about solving those problems for Singapore. The book is inspiring. So if you are in search of a book on the philosophy of hard work, planning, improvisation, it is this book, From Third World to First. Attitudes. Could we raise a large citizen army like Switzerland's or Israel's at northern Nigeria? From the 1960s to now, political leaders are not interested in good education. So where there is lack of good education, you will produce children with poor mentality. At the end of the day, the children will grow into elders that will be mentally befogged. They will be psychologically benighted. They won't think rightly. Because they don't think rightly, they are prone to violence. And that is what you find in northern Nigeria. Not just the north. The buffer you have in a place like the Southwest was provided by the free education launched by Obafemi Awolowo before Nigeria's independence. That has created a buffer for Southwest of Nigeria. But since that time, the standard of education in Yoruba land has been falling. As it continues to fall, it will take the character of the North. Because as the quality of education falls, it simply means that the elite strata will become narrower. As the elite strata gets narrower, the elites become feudalistic. When they become feudalistic, you see them, they will embark on the mission to say, we want to feed the poor. They begin to set up foundation to give people food. That means the poor will always cluster around them to eat. That is feudalism. A poor that cannot feed itself cannot own land. It simply means the narrow elite will own all the lands. They will buy them up. And the others become serfs. They become poor and powerless if they want to. Lee Kuan Yew didn't want to build such a society for Singapore. So they gave themselves a decade to achieve good standard of education, to be able to change the attitude of Singaporeans. To change the mindset of people requires intense education because it is mind re-engineering. When Britain came, if you read Okonkwo, Arrow of God, Britain was on a mission of mind re-engineering, telling the African that you must believe in our God. They began to set up schools. They came with the Bible. They came with education, their own form of education, to be able to re-engineer our minds. We began to answer their names, Edmund, Matthew. We began to answer their names, Thomas. At some point, even in our schools, it became an offense to speak the local language. They called it vernacular. It is mind re-engineering. So Nigeria at this point need a deliberate mind re-engineering that must be pursued by a philosophical leadership class. Linkwayu is an embodiment of such a philosophy. Obafemi Awolowo. Because Obafemi Awolowo created a buffer for Yoruba land with free education that was established many years ago, Yoruba land remains somewhat stable. But as you can see, within the edges of Yoruba land, bandits are clustering. Zeke Michael Okpara invested in the southeast, yes. But the intensity of the investment in education in the southeast could not match that of the southwest. And you could see the southeast collapsed in terms of insecurity before the southwest. The southeast insurgency is still there. As we speak, the governor of Anambra State has closed down main market because the people don't come to market on Monday. They are honoring the spirit of the insurgency, the Igbo insurgency. If you think there won't be a Yoruba insurgency, you will be lying. The only thing that can stop it is the rethinking of leadership. Look, alleged coup, military to court-martial 16 officers. That means Nigeria is still talking about coup d'etat. Alleged coup. Military to court-martial 16 officers. And if you look at the name of the 16 officers, they are majorly from northern Nigeria. Does that remind you of the January coup? Majorly from Igbo land. Can you remember the Gideon Oka coup? Majorly from the Niger Delta. The ethnic question. Alleged coup, military to court-martial 16 officers. That is on the front page of today's Tribune. You also look at the front page of the Nation newspaper. Military set to court-martial suspect for alleged coup. You see that on the front page of the Nation newspaper. The Nation. On the back page, Malami and Mohammed haunted by their past. Plot to breach presidential villa security. To go ahead for military tribunal. So that was an attempted coup in Nigeria. An attempted coup in Benin. A successful coup in Burkina Faso. A successful coup in Niger. A successful coup in Guinea. A successful coup in Gabon. And like Professor Araoye said in the last interview I had with him, that more coups will come. It is taking us back to the 1960s. coups were coming. And Nigeria got her own share on the 15th of January, 1966. So if you look at the front pages of the newspapers, and if I bring you the newspapers of the 1980s, I will bring some of those papers, and we compare them to today's headlines, you discover nothing has changed. The headlines, if I remove the date, you will think they are talking about today. Okay, look at the Punch. Presidential panel recommends freeze on 1 trillion naira rice imports. We've always imported rice. Yet we have savanna land, good for rice production in the north. Yet we can't feed ourselves. Court decides today as FCT workers demand Wike's removal. The name Wike is boring, so let's not talk about it. Then deadly winter storm hits United States, 17 killed, flights grounded. Over 400,000 jostle for 50,000 police jobs. The more police we employ, the more insecure we become. Have you asked why? Who are you employing into the police force? The same people who came out of the poor educational institutions. So they will go with that mindset into the police force. And the police force is already a den of corruption. And they are affected by the bug. A system governed by corruption cannot check insecurity. It's how political elites and institutions interact in building nations. Professor Adigun Agbaje is of the Department of Political Science, University of Ibadan. He is on State Affairs.
Before 1966-67, we hadn't lost our innocence as a people.
We've lost it now.
But then we lost it. But then for what purpose? Just to entrench an elite and a system that continues to erode institutions. You mentioned institutions. Institutions are core to the life of a people. But we then entrench a system that eroded institutions, that promoted personal rule, which further will erode institutions. Core values supportive of stability, democracy, and development. And then you are back to worse forms of what people will call colonial rule, but of course involving local elite.
Is the Nigerian state due for reforms?
Can the Nigerian state be reformed? Yes, of course, it is due for reform. There are all kinds of pathologies. A disconnect between the rulers and the ruled, an attempt by fractions of the ruling class to in fact divide the ruled. Like I said earlier, a ruling elite that is basically not strategic, that is basically very selfish. No state can develop in the context in which all these things are happening. There is a disconnect between rural and urban areas. There is absolute immobility. A lot of us are we don't move around. I've had the luck of moving around many parts of this country. And in the last decade, the situation has gotten worse. You see, transportation is a key element of building a strong, coherent state system. We don't have it. In fact, what we had 10 years ago is far better than what we have now. So people cannot move. There's immobility. Our highways are not safe. They are disappearing like they disappeared in Zaire, DRC. In fact, now the better news is coming out of DRC. A few years ago, one of my sons went there on an official visit. And the first thing that happened as the plane landed was that Wi-Fi was on, free access. So he sent a WhatsApp to me that, can you imagine, I just landed in DRC and there's free Wi-Fi.
A war-torn country.
A war-torn country, So we need to have all those kinds of perspectives.
But how come this group of elites continue to impose themselves on the system?
Because they have the space to be, let me say, irresponsible. Because the people, I don't like blaming victims. The Nigerian people have long been victims of their elite. So I would say that advisedly, that we continue to give the elite space to misbehave. That space has, in the last couple of years, started to, close. But we need to do more. Civil society needs to do more. Community organizations used to do more. We need to hold the diseased state in a constant mode. In other words, let's assume the worst possible scenario with regard to those who control the state. Now, it's not really the state, it's those in charge of the state that, create these kinds of pathologies. And then what's been happening in the last couple of years is that civil society organizations, they have their own, negative dimensions, but our hope now lies in civil society organizations, community-based activism, community organizations, to begin to hold our rulers at all levels, not just in government, our leaders, everywhere, the same culture of community action. It is that kind of mobilization that can lead us to a better path for the Nigerian state.
Professor Adigun Agbaje talked about the insecurity on our roads. I had that interview with him in 2019. Before you knew it, he was also kidnapped on the highway. Yes, that professor was kidnapped on the highway, on the Lagos-Ibadan highway. He was kidnapped. You see the analysis he gave. After that analysis, he became a victim. Bandit, headsman. So let's go back to 2021. Let's go back to 2021. Muhammadu Buhari was the president. When the tension was boiling over, the like of the governor of Benue State, Samuel Otom, were not giving up. They were shouting, fighting. So perhaps Buhari came under pressure. And he gave the military 6 weeks to stem the activities of bandits. He was angry about the bandits killing and kidnapping persons around the country. So he gave the military 6 weeks. Get these guys down. He ordered that anyone found with AK-47 be shot. If you see the person with AK-47 and it's not a military man, shoot that person. Presidential orders. That was part of Buhari's administration's desperate measures to contain the violence in Nigeria. He reaffirmed that shoot on sight order again and again. So here, while addressing traditional rulers at the State House in Abuja in March 2021, Buhari re-echoed, shoot anyone with AK-47.
And staff, Inspector General of Police, and the rest and staff, Inspector General.
Buhari back to life. He gave that order 6 weeks. 6 weeks. This is 2026.